The closest star to our Sun, Proxima Centauri, sits at a distance of 4.24 light-years. At the speed of the fastest object humanity has ever launched, Voyager One, the trip would take roughly 73,000 years. 73,000 years ago, modern humans were sharing the planet with Neanderthals. Even at the fastest velocity any human-built craft has ever achieved, the journey would last 6,600 years. No human lives long enough to make this voyage. No genealogy lives long enough. The architecture engineers keep arriving at, after 100 years of trying every alternative, is something stranger. A vehicle that travels for centuries, carrying a population that replaces itself across 15 generations until the population reaches the other end. The people who arrive are not the people who left. They are something else. What does it mean to send a voyage that no traveller takes? Get comfortable. Subscribe if you have not and stick around, because what we are about to walk through is a voyage in which the person who arrives may not be anyone the founders would recognise. Let's get into it. Part 1. The Voyage with No Traveller. Every voyage in human history has been a voyage that someone takes. Someone climbs into the boat. Someone walks onto the ship. Someone straps themselves into the capsule. The voyager is the one who leaves and the one who arrives, and the gap between the two is filled with the same person. Slightly older, slightly changed, but recognisably continuous. Whether it is a sailor crossing the Atlantic in the 1500s, or an astronaut sleeping in a bunk aboard the International Space Station for 300 days, the rule is the same. You go, you return, you are still you when you do. The voyage we are about to talk about does not work like that. The voyage we are about to talk about is the only voyage in human history where the rule breaks. The voyage we are about to talk about is the longest voyage humanity will ever attempt. And the strange, almost vertiginous truth of it is this: the voyage will not be taken by anyone. The crew that leaves is not the crew that arrives. The people who set sail will be dead, and so will their children, and so will their grandchildren, and so will their great-grandchildren before the ship gets where it is going. The people who arrive will be the descendants of the founders. They will not have boarded, they will have been born. They will spend their entire lives, from first breath to last, inside the metal hull of a vehicle that is going somewhere their ancestors chose. And when they get there, what arrives at the second star is not the people who decided to go. It is a population that the original we set in motion, and that population by the time it arrives is something the original we would have to be introduced to the way you would be introduced to a stranger. That is the kind of thing it is. That is the inverted shape of it. Most voyages are vehicles for people. This voyage is a vehicle that turns people into something else slowly, across centuries, while they live their ordinary lives inside it. Nobody on board chose the destination. Nobody on board chose to leave. Almost nobody on board will ever see the destination. And yet the voyage is the only kind of voyage that, under the actual physics of interstellar travel, could ever carry crewed life from one star to another. It is the only practical way. It is the way every serious interstellar studies group keeps coming back to, after 100 years of trying to find another way. It is also the way that, when you really look at it for long enough, you realise is not really a voyage at all in the sense the word usually means. It is something else. We do not have a good word for what it is. We are going to take the time tonight to look at it carefully, where the idea came from, the engineering papers that have been quietly working on it for decades, why the human body by itself cannot make this trip, what the closed ecosystem experiments have told us about whether a self-contained world inside a hull can keep itself alive for the time the voyage requires, what isolated populations of humans do to each other in the long term when there is no horizon to walk to, and the part the engineering papers tend to skip past because there is no equation for it, the descendants. Because here is the thing that the engineering papers do not quite say, and that the popular treatments tend to dance around. The hardest problem in a generation ship voyage is not propulsion. The hardest problem is not radiation shielding. The hardest problem is not even the closed ecosystem, although that is so hard we have never come close to solving it. The hardest problem is the one that does not have a number attached to it. The hardest problem is what happens across 15 or 20 or 250 generations to the people who were never asked. The children who were born into the ship, the grandchildren who never saw a sky that was not painted on a window, the great-great-great-great-grandchildren who, when the ship arrives, will have to decide whether the mission their ancestors planned is still their mission. They might say no. They might say it is not their mission. They might say it never was. This is the part that, in 1975, was barely talked about. By 2006, it had a name and a paper attached to it. By 2018, it had simulations. By 2019, it had ethical philosophers writing peer-reviewed objections to the entire concept on consent grounds. And by the time you've walked all the way through it, by the time you've heard the full chain of who has thought about it and what they have concluded, you will understand why a serious treatment of the longest voyage humanity will ever attempt has to be a treatment of the people on board, not the engine under them. So let us begin where most of the writing on this subject begins, because the writing on this subject has been remarkably consistent for almost a century. Let us begin with the distance. Let us begin with how far the closest star really is, and what that distance does to the human lifespan, and to the rocket equation, and to the room we would have to build to put people in for the time it takes to cross it. Let us begin with the size of the problem before we begin with the strangeness of it. Because the strangeness is what we will end on, but the size is what makes the strangeness possible. Part 2. How far is far? The closest star to our Sun is called Proxima Centauri. It is a small, dim red dwarf, the kind of star you cannot see from Earth without a telescope, and it sits at a distance of 4.2465 light-years from us. A light-year is the distance that light travels in 1 year, moving at 300,000 kilometers per second. Light, in case it has been a while since you thought about this, is the fastest thing that exists. Nothing in the known universe moves faster than light moves, and it takes light, travelling at its top speed, 4 years, 2 months, and a little over a week to get from Proxima Centauri to here. That is the closest star. That is the nearest other sun. Now let us put a number next to a vehicle. The fastest object ever built by human hands and pointed away from Earth is a probe called Voyager One. NASA launched it on September the 5th, 1977. It is 48 years old as I'm speaking. It has been moving outward in a more or less straight line ever since. It is currently the most distant human-made object in existence. As of the last data point we have, it is past 167 astronomical units from the Sun. That is over 24 billion kilometers. That is past the place where the Sun's solar wind ends and the matter of the wider galaxy begins, the boundary scientists call the heliopause, which Voyager 1 crossed on August 25, 2012. Voyager 1 is moving at about 17 kilometers per second relative to the Sun. Let me put that in terms you can hold in your head. Voyager 1 is covering the distance from New York to Los Angeles every 3.5 minutes. A jet airliner takes 6 hours to make that crossing. Voyager 1 makes it in 3.5 minutes. From any reasonable terrestrial perspective, that is fast. From the perspective of interstellar travel, it is not fast at all. How long would Voyager 1 take at its current speed to reach Proxima Centauri? Roughly 73,000 years. 73,000 years. Take a moment with that number. 73,000 years ago, modern humans were sharing the planet with Neanderthals. The first cave paintings in Lascaux had not been painted yet. The wheel had not been invented. Civilization had not been invented. Language as we know it had probably not finished evolving into its modern form. If a Voyager-class probe had been launched at that point in human history, it would only now be arriving at the nearest star. That is the gap. That is the distance, expressed not in kilometers, but in the only currency that matters for a crewed mission. Time. Voyager 1, though, is not the fastest spacecraft we have ever built. That title belongs to a mission called Parker Solar Probe, which NASA launched in 2018 and which has been making increasingly close passes by the Sun ever since. At its closest approach to the Sun, called perihelion, Parker Solar Probe reaches a velocity of approximately 192 kilometers per second relative to the Sun. That is more than 10 times faster than Voyager 1. It is the fastest any human-built object has ever moved. At that speed, a trip to Proxima Centauri would take about 6,600 years. 6,600 years. That is the kind of number that is supposed to make you feel better than 73,000. It does not really make you feel better. 6,600 years ago, we were just beginning to build the first cities in Mesopotamia. The Great Pyramid had not been built yet. Writing had not been invented. The earliest forms of agriculture were spreading out of the Levant. If a Parker-speed mission had been launched then, it would only now be arriving at the next sun. But this is the part that matters, the part that is easy to miss when you are looking at the numbers. Parker Solar Probe does not move at 192 km per second the whole time. That is its peak velocity, achieved during the closest part of its solar swing, with the Sun's gravity doing most of the work. Parker's actual departure velocity, if you tried to redirect it outward toward Proxima, would be much lower. The peak speed is a number we cannot sustain. It is a moment, not a journey. So the actual ceiling of crude interstellar travel, with chemical and gravitational propulsion, the kind we have actually achieved, is somewhere between Voyager One's 17 km per second and Parker's transient 192. Call it, for the sake of argument, somewhere in the tens of kilometers per second sustained. That puts Proxima Centauri tens of thousands of years away. No human, and no plausible chain of humans linked by genealogy and continuous record, lives long enough to see the other end. And so, the first thing the engineering papers always have to do is admit this. They have to admit that the rocket equation will not let you cheat the distance with chemical propulsion. The equation, written down by a Russian schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in 1903, says that the velocity change you can achieve equals the exhaust velocity of your propellant multiplied by the natural logarithm of the ratio of your starting mass to your ending mass. To double your delta V, you have to square the mass ratio. To triple it, you have to cube it. To go really fast, you need a starting mass that is exponentially larger than your ending mass, and that exponential climbs into absurdity very quickly. Chemical propellants top out at exhaust velocities of about 4.5 km per second. That sets a hard ceiling. To get a usefully large payload to 1% of light speed using chemical fuel, the mass ratio required is, depending on the assumptions, somewhere between hundreds and thousands. To get to 10%, the mass ratio runs into the millions. There is not enough chemical fuel on Earth, by orders of magnitude, to push a crude ship to those speeds using ordinary rockets. The math forecloses the option before you even get to the engineering. So humanity, for 100 years now, has been trying to find a way around the rocket equation. Fusion propulsion, laser-pushed light sail propulsion, nuclear pulse propulsion, ion propulsion. Some of these are mature concepts, some are speculative. None of them has been built and flown at the scales required for crude interstellar travel. Most of the more realistic designs require centuries to reach Proxima. The fastest crude mission concept that has been seriously worked through sits somewhere in the range of a few % of light speed at the upper end. That gives you a Proxima trip in the high tens to low hundreds of years. A more conservative crude design runs to several hundred years. The longest serious proposals run to thousands of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years. Those are the numbers that the architecture has to wrap around. Those are the numbers that, if you do the math on a single human lifetime of 70 or 80 years, force you into one of two answers. Either the people on board do not stay people the whole way, which is the cryogenic and the digital upload route, both of which fail as engineering concepts in ways we will get to. Or the people on board are replaced by their descendants generation after generation until the ship arrives. The second answer is the generation ship, and it is the second answer that the literature, after every alternative has been tried, keeps coming back to. The voyage, in other words, is not too long for humans. It is too long for any human. It is exactly the kind of voyage that requires more than one generation of humans, in sequence, to complete. The architecture is not a vehicle that goes very fast. It is a vehicle that goes slowly, carrying a population that replaces itself until the population reaches the other end. That is the size of the problem. That is the shape the architecture has to fit. Now let us look at where the idea came from. Part 3. The first people to think of it. The first person on record to think this problem through in any serious way was Robert Goddard. You probably know Goddard, if you know him at all, as the American physicist who built the first liquid-fueled rocket. He launched it on March 16, 1926, from his Aunt Effie's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts. The rocket went 41 feet straight up, and then crashed into a cabbage patch. Goddard, working alone with hand-built equipment, on a farm in central Massachusetts, had just invented the practical rocket. What is less well known is that, 8 years before that flight, in the winter of 1918, Goddard wrote a small, strange manuscript that he never submitted for publication. He titled it The Last Migration. He was 36 years old at the time. He was recovering from tuberculosis at his mother's home in Worcester, Massachusetts. The First World War had just ended. The flu pandemic was killing tens of millions of people across the globe, and from a sickbed, looking out at a world that had not yet seen the Apollo program, the laser, the digital computer, or even the discovery of Pluto, Robert Goddard wrote what is probably the first technically serious description of a generation ship. The manuscript imagines a future in which the sun is dying and Earth has become uninhabitable. Goddard's solution is to send asteroid-sized arcs across the galaxy. Frozen passengers, cryogenically preserved DNA, automated systems to wake the crew when the destination is reached. Goddard did not know the word cryogenic in its modern sense. He did not know the structure of DNA. He was writing 107 years before us, and yet he had already, working with the science available to him, arrived at the architecture that the modern interstellar studies community keeps coming back to. The arc, the long, slow voyage, the descendants who are not the founders, the destination that nobody who left will ever see. He sealed the manuscript and asked that it not be opened until 50 years after his death. It was published in 1972, decades after Goddard had died. For the next 46 years after Goddard wrote his manuscript, the concept of the generation ship lived mostly in science fiction. Robert Heinlein wrote a famous short novel called Universe in 1941, in which the descendants aboard a generation ship had forgotten that they were on a ship at all. They thought the metal hull was the entire world. The forward end of the ship was the sky, the rotation was gravity, the engineering deck was a forbidden region of myth. Heinlein's story made the same point that the engineering papers would make 70 years later. The descendants are not the founders. The descendants are something else. The mission, once it crosses the threshold of a single human lifetime, is no longer a mission anyone alive can remember as theirs. But it was not until 1964 that someone tried to actually design one. His name was Robert Ensman. He was an American physicist working at a small aerospace firm in Massachusetts. He proposed what came to be called the Ensman Starship. It was a serious design, with serious numbers attached. The vehicle was 600 meters long, the length of about 6 football fields. It massed 600,000 tons. The front of the ship was a great spherical reservoir of frozen deuterium, the fuel for the fusion engines at the back. Behind the deuterium ball, a series of cylindrical habitats spun for artificial gravity, with 200 initial crew aboard. The propulsion was nuclear pulse fusion, like Project Orion but with deuterium burn, and the cruise velocity was a few % of the speed of light, with target voyage times of around 200 years. Ensman's design was, by the standards of the field at the time, careful. He had thought about radiation shielding. He had thought about the habitats. He had thought about the fuel as the front shield, because at relativistic-ish speeds, interstellar hydrogen comes at you as ionizing radiation, and a thick wall of deuterium ice in front of the crew compartments doubles as both fuel reservoir and absorber. He had thought, in a preliminary way, about the population dynamics, although the demographic modelling that would later refine those numbers had not yet been done. What Ensman had not solved, and what the field would spend the next 60 years trying to solve, was the population question. 200 initial crew, 200 years of voyage. That is roughly 8 generations of humans on board, depending on how you count. 8 generations is enough time for languages to drift, for cultures to diverge, for the original mission to become a story rather than an objective. 8 generations is more than enough time for any closed social system humans have ever built to either evolve into something unrecognizable or collapse. Ensman's design was elegant on paper. The people inside it were a problem that the paper did not address. 9 years after Ensman, in 1973, the British Interplanetary Society opened a study group of their own. They were specifically trying to design an uncrewed interstellar probe, not a generation ship, but the design they produced, called Project Daedalus, set the engineering vocabulary for everything that came after. Daedalus was finished in 1978. It was a 54,000-ton, 2-stage nuclear pulse fusion design, burning deuterium and helium-3 pellets ignited by electron beams at a rate of 250 per second. The cruise velocity was 12% of the speed of light. The target was Barnard's star, almost 6 light-years away. The voyage time was about 50 years. The design was an uncrewed flyby, with no provision for deceleration at the destination, no crew compartments, no life support. It was a glorified probe. But here is why Daedalus mattered. Daedalus showed that even with extrapolated near-term physics, with no warp drive, no exotic propellant, no breakthroughs we did not have a clear path to, the upper end of interstellar capability sat at around 10% of light speed for an uncrewed vehicle. To carry a crew with all the additional mass of life support and shielding and habitable volume and deceleration fuel, you would have to slow down, way down. The crewed envelope after Daedalus settled somewhere in the range of 1 to 10% of light speed, and the lower end of that range made a Proxima Centauri trip a 400-year voyage on the lower end. 420 years if you ran the numbers carefully. In 2009, the Tau Zero Foundation and the British Interplanetary Society together opened a reanalysis of Daedalus called Project Icarus. It was meant to take the 70s-era assumptions and update them with the engineering knowledge of the early 21st century. Some of the changes were technical, like better fusion ignition modelling. Some were philosophical, like the question of whether a deceleration option could be added to bring the probe to a stop at its destination. Icarus is still ongoing in various forms. It is the institutional descendant of Daedalus, and it has continued the slow, patient work of trying to figure out what is actually possible. In 2014, the Initiative for Interstellar Studies, an organisation founded by Kelvin Long and a small group of researchers, launched a different kind of study. They called it Project Hyperion, and unlike Daedalus and Icarus, Hyperion was explicitly about crewed multi-generational starships. They were not designing a probe, they were designing the population. Hyperion's working group asked questions that the propulsion-oriented designs had carefully avoided. How many people do you need? How do you keep their genes from collapsing through inbreeding? How do you keep their society from fracturing? What governance structure could survive 10 generations? What if someone aboard decides, 4 generations in, that the mission is a mistake? What if a faction tries to seize the ship? What happens to the people on board over 400 years of confinement? These are not propulsion questions. These are questions for population biologists, sociologists, anthropologists, ethical philosophers. Hyperion was the first sustained study to take those questions as central rather than peripheral, and Hyperion is, in many ways, where the conversation became modern. It is the project that pulled the architecture out of the propulsion lab and into the social science seminar. It is the project under which the deepest of the questions we're going to look at tonight came to be formally asked. And it is the project that, as of right now, in the middle of the 2020s, is still running, still drawing collaborators from every continent, still trying to figure out a problem that nobody has yet solved on paper, let alone in a hull. This is the lineage. Goddard's sickbed manuscript in 1918. Heinlein's Lost Civilization parable in 1941. Ensman's careful, propulsion-oriented design in 1964. Daedalus in the 1970s. Icarus in the 2009s. Hyperion in the 20-teens. 100 years of thinking by some of the most careful people in the interstellar studies community has not produced a generation ship. It has produced a stack of papers, a long catalogue of unsolved problems, and a growing sense year by year that the problem the field thought it was solving was not the problem that actually mattered. So now let's look at the problem that actually matters, the one that the population genetics modelling started to make legible in 2018. Let us look at what the ship is when you stop thinking of it as a vehicle and start thinking of it as a population. Part 4. The ship as population. In 2018, a French astrophysicist named Frédéric Marin, working at the University of Strasbourg with a collaborator named Camille Belouffi, published a paper in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society that changed how the field talked about the ship. The paper introduced a software tool they had built called Heritage. Heritage was an agent-based simulation, which is a particular kind of computer model. It does not predict the system by writing down one big equation and solving it. It predicts the system by simulating every individual person inside it, day by day, year by year, decision by decision, across the full span of the voyage. Every birth, every death, every marriage, every pregnancy, every accident, every genetic combination. The software runs the entire population, person by person, for 6,300 years. 6,300 years was the number Marin and Belouffi chose because they were modelling a Proxima Centauri voyage at a cruise velocity of 0.8% of the speed of light. Less than 1% of the speed of light. Slow by the standards of the propulsion fantasies, but not unreasonable for a serious crewed ship design with no exotic technology. 6,300 years is roughly 250 human generations, if you take a generation as 25 years. It is more than the entire span of recorded human history. It is the time between the founding of the first cities in Mesopotamia and right now. And what Marin and Belufi were asking, in this very long agent-based simulation, was a very specific question. How small can the founding crew be and still arrive intact? The answer, when they ran the simulation thousands of times under different starting conditions and slightly different rules, was startling. With strict mate-pairing rules, with a hard ban on consanguineous reproduction, with a stable 2-child-per-couple replacement rate, with zero genetic catastrophe and zero major external shocks, the absolute mathematical minimum founder crew that could survive a 6,300-year voyage was around 98 people. 98 founders, perfectly managed, could in theory reach Proxima Centauri with a viable population still on board, but that was the absolute minimum, the floor below which the simulation always collapsed. It assumed no plagues, no accidental decompressions, no genetic surprises, no reproductive failures, no murders, no coup attempts, no populations that decided somewhere around generation 70 that they did not want to have any more children. None of the things that actually happen, eventually, to every real population of humans across centuries. Marin and Belufi were the first to admit that 98 was a thought experiment, not a recommendation. When they ran the simulation with realistic variance, with normal demographic and biological shocks, with normal human imperfection, the survivable founder population climbed dramatically. The recommended realistic floor, the one they actually defended for a real mission, was somewhere around 500 founders. 500 people carefully selected for genetic diversity, locked into a system that managed their reproduction across 250 generations, with at least some allowance for the catastrophes that always happen. 500 was the number that survived stress testing. 500 was the number that could lose a generation to a plague, lose another generation to a sex ratio anomaly, lose a third generation to a leadership failure, and still arrive with a viable breeding population. 500. The size of a small country town, a village, the kind of community where everyone knows everyone, where there is one general store and one school and one bar, where the same families have been intermarrying for centuries, for 250 generations, and even that was just the start of the harder modelling. Cameron Smith, an anthropologist at Portland State University, had already proposed, in a paper published in Acta Astronautica in 2014, that for very long voyages the realistic minimum was probably in the multiple thousands rather than the hundreds. Smith argued that genetic diversity over 6,000 years requires a standing pool large enough to absorb the slow loss of allelic richness through random drift. A 500-person founder population over enough generations drifts toward homogeneity. It does not stay genetically diverse forever, even with perfect management. The realistic crew, Smith argued, was in the thousands at launch. The initiative for interstellar studies, when it ran the Hyperion architecture, tended to converge on similar numbers. Several thousand founders, with carefully managed reproduction, and a recommended infrastructure capacity for population growth into the high tens of thousands or low hundreds of thousands across the voyage. Earlier, in 2003, John Moore, an anthropologist working specifically on the Polynesian voyaging analogue, had proposed a floor of around 80 founders. Moore based his argument on the historical record of small founding populations that had successfully populated Pacific islands. The Polynesian voyagers reached and sustained populations on isolated islands, with very small initial colonies. Moore's 80 was less aggressive than Marin and Belufi's later 98, but it survived only the gentlest assumptions and did not hold up under more rigorous modelling. So the answer to the question, how many people do you need on board, is not a single number. It is a range. The absolute mathematical minimum with perfect management is around 100. The realistic minimum for a real mission with normal stresses is around 500. The recommended size for a robust mission with multi-millennial genetic stability is several thousand. The Hyperion working numbers tend toward the high end of that range, and here is the part the propulsion engineers do not love. Every one of those numbers turns the ship from a vehicle into a community. 100 is a village. 500 is a town. Several thousand is a small city. The ship has to be a small city in a sealed metal hull for centuries without anyone leaving and without anyone arriving from outside. But the demographic question, even after Merrin and Beluffi's simulation, is not the deepest question. The deepest question that emerged from the population modelling era of the 2010s is what happens to the people on board over centuries in this kind of community. And here is where the propulsion engineers and the population biologists handed the conversation, often reluctantly, over to the sociologists, the anthropologists, and the ethical philosophers. Because the moment you accept that the ship is a population, you have to ask the questions a population biologist cannot answer. What kind of governance survives 10 generations? What kind of education system keeps the mission alive when the mission's founders have been dead for 2 centuries? What happens to the families who have spent 15 generations confined to a hull with no exit and no horizon? What happens to the children who have never seen a sky that was not a window? Smith and Schreiber, in a 2013 paper, did some of the early demographic stability modelling on this question. They asked what happens to a closed population over multiple generations when there is no migration in or out, when reproduction is managed for genetic diversity, and when the population's purpose is set by founders who are no longer alive. Their answer, distilled, was that without active demographic management, generation ship populations either crash or balloon within 6 generations. The dynamics are unstable. A small underestimate of food supply leads to a crash. A small overestimate of food supply leads to overshoot and crash. The closed system requires not just management, but constant ongoing recalibration by people who, after a few generations, have never lived in any system other than this one. The people doing the managing have themselves been managed by the ship's culture since birth. There is nobody on board with experience of a different kind of system. There is no outside reference frame. And then there is the genetic drift problem. Hill, Marin and Pearson published a paper in 2022 in the International Journal of Astrobiology in which they modelled the slow drift of allele frequencies in a closed 500-person founding population. Over 400 years, the drift was measurable but bounded. Over 6,000 years, the drift began to dominate. The population that arrived at the destination was, by some metrics, genetically distinct from the population that had launched. Not a different species, not a Neanderthal to modern human distance, but far enough apart that, if you sampled them and compared them, you would say with confidence that these were 2 related populations, not the same one. The species, in some loose sense, drifts, not because of evolution under selection. The selection pressures inside a ship are not the same as the selection pressures on a planet. The drift is simply because closed populations, over enough time, randomly lose alleles and converge toward a different distribution than the one they started with. The ship arrives, in this sense, with descendants who are still human but who are not quite, in the strictest population genetic sense, the same humans who left. This is what it means to think of the ship as a population. The ship is a small civilization. The ship is a slow river of births and deaths. The ship is a closed gene pool that drifts. The ship is a culture that mutates, generation by generation, away from the culture of the founders. The ship is a system that cannot be designed by propulsion engineers alone, because the propulsion engineers cannot tell you what happens to the 7th generation. Nobody can tell you what happens to the 7th generation, because no human society has ever existed in a sealed metal cylinder for 7 generations. We do not have the data. We have only simulations and analogies, and the analogies, when we look at them in the next part, are not encouraging. Part 5. The Glass and the Steel. In the desert outside Oracle, Arizona, about 35 miles north of Tucson, there is a complex of glass and steel domes called Biosphere 2. It is still there. You can drive up to the gate. The structure was built between 1987 and 1991 by a company called Space Biosphere Ventures, with private funding mostly from the oil heir Ed Bass. It cost approximately $150 million in 1991 currency. The total enclosed volume was about 27 million cubic feet. Inside the glass were 7 different biomes: a rainforest, a coral reef ocean with sand beaches, a saltwater marsh, a savanna, a desert, an agricultural plot, a human habitat with apartments, a library, a kitchen, a clinic. It was supposed to be the most ambitious closed ecosystem experiment ever attempted. On September 26th, 1991, 8 crew members walked into the airlock. The doors closed behind them. They were not supposed to come out again for 2 years. The 8 crew members were not astronauts. They were a mixed group of researchers, students, and people drawn from a long-running experimental community that had been planning Biosphere 2 for years. They had been trained in agriculture, in animal husbandry, in atmospheric monitoring, in basic medical care. They had stocked the agricultural plot with what they thought was enough seed and starter livestock for 2 years. They had preloaded the ocean with reef fish and sea life. They had introduced earthworms and pollinating insects. They had planted thousands of species of tropical trees. The biosphere was, on paper, a working closed loop. It started failing within weeks. The first problem was carbon dioxide. The level inside the dome began climbing. The crew had expected that the plants would take up the carbon dioxide their bodies produced. The plants did some of that work. But the soil microbes inside the agricultural plot, which had been deliberately enriched to produce strong crops, were also respiring. The microbes were producing more carbon dioxide than the plants could absorb, and carbon dioxide at the levels the dome was reaching would slow human cognition and make the crew sluggish and slow. But carbon dioxide was not the worst of it. The oxygen began dropping. Slowly at first, 21% at the start, 20.5% a few weeks in, 20%, 19%. By 16 months in, January of 1993, the oxygen inside the dome was at 14.5%. That is the oxygen level you would breathe at the top of a 17,000-foot mountain. The crew was lightheaded, they were sleeping badly, they were having trouble with simple tasks. One of the crew members later described the experience of trying to add a column of numbers and finding she could not hold the figures in her head long enough to finish the addition. Her brain was running on too little oxygen. The cause was eventually traced. The concrete in the dome was not fully cured when the doors closed. Concrete absorbs oxygen as it cures. The biosphere had been built and sealed too quickly. As the concrete hardened over months, it pulled oxygen out of the air faster than the plants could replace it. Mass balance held. The oxygen was not destroyed, it was bound into the concrete. But for the 8 people inside, it was as good as gone. In January 1993, the Biosphere 2 management decided to inject external oxygen into the dome. This was a violation of the closure protocol. It was, by definition, a failure of the experiment. The crew was no longer in a closed system. They were in a system being supplemented from outside. The mission's central premise had broken 16 months in. That was the air. The food was its own disaster. The agricultural plot had been planted with crops carefully selected for closed ecosystem cultivation. Sweet potatoes, bananas, rice, beans. The crew was supposed to eat what they grew. They did for a while. But the yields were lower than expected. Some crops failed entirely. The crew, after the first few months, was constantly hungry. They lost weight. The doctor inside the biosphere, Roy Wolford, who had been studying caloric restriction as a longevity intervention, encouraged the crew to view the calorie deficit as a healthy fast. Some of the crew were not convinced. By the end of the first year, several of them were eating less than the body needs to maintain weight in long-term ways. The doctor's blood work showed dramatic changes. Cholesterol dropped, blood pressure dropped, some markers of health improved. The crew was hungry the entire time. The animals fared even worse than the food. The dome had been stocked with about 25 small vertebrate species. Within the 2-year mission, 19 of those 25 species went extinct inside the dome. The fish in the ocean died off. Some of the lizards died. The mammals struggled. The crew had no way to bring in replacement animals. The mission was closed. The species that died were simply gone in this ecosystem forever. The pollinators died too. All of them. Every pollinating insect species that the biosphere had been stocked with collapsed within the first months. The crops that required pollination had to be hand-pollinated by the crew. The crew, in addition to growing their own food in a closed system, were now performing the role of every honeybee and bumblebee in the biome. And the morning glories took the agricultural plot. Morning glories had been planted as a ground cover. They were not supposed to be a major crop, but they thrived in the high carbon dioxide environment, and they spread across the agricultural area faster than the crew could pull them. By the end of the first year, the agricultural plot was a riot of morning glories, climbing the support beams, draping across the food crops, choking everything. The crew spent hours every day fighting them. Then there was the social collapse. The 8-person crew had not been chosen for psychological compatibility in any rigorous way. They were a group of people who had been working together on the larger Biosphere 2 project for years, but the long-term confinement, the hunger, the low oxygen, and the failing mission combined to do what long-term confinement does to small groups under stress. They fractured. 2 factions emerged. One faction supported the mission's leadership. The other faction wanted to question the way the experiment was being run, the way data was being shared with the outside world, the way the early failures were being characterized. By the end of the mission, the 2 factions were not speaking to each other. They lived together in the same dome, ate together at the same table, breathed the same thin air, and could not have a conversation. On September 26, 1993, exactly 2 years after entering, the 8 crew members walked out of the airlock. The mission was, by every measure that had been used to define it at the start, a failure. The closed ecosystem premise had broken 16 months in when external oxygen was injected. The food loop had broken, the species loop had broken, the pollinator loop had broken, the crew was malnourished, hypoxic, and socially shattered. Biosphere 2 became, in the press of the time, a punchline, a joke. The journalists who covered the mission's exit were not kind. But here is the thing. Biosphere 2 was the most rigorous closed ecosystem experiment ever conducted at human scale on Earth. There was nothing more ambitious before it, and there has been nothing more ambitious since. Every other closed system experiment, before and after, has been smaller, shorter, or both. Bios 3 in the Soviet Union, in the 1970s and 80s, ran 3-person tests for up to 180 days, but never closed the food loop and never sealed against external air. The European Space Agency's Melissa project has been working since 1989 to develop a 5-compartment bioregenerative life support system, and as of right now, more than 35 years in, the full 5-compartment closure has never been demonstrated. The 4th compartment, the spirulina compartment, has been running stably at a pilot scale at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona for years. The full loop, end-to-end, with humans and waste and food and oxygen all balanced, has not been closed. Lunar Palace 1, a Chinese closed ecosystem facility built by Beihang University in Beijing, ran a 370-day mission in 2017 and 2018 with 4 crew. It is the longest closed ecosystem run on record. 370 days. It maintained closure better than Biosphere 2 did. It was also 1/20th the size of Biosphere 2, with 1/2 the crew, and ran for half the duration. It is by every measure a serious success. It is also by every measure a small step toward a problem that is many orders of magnitude larger than it. Here is the math. Biosphere. 2 ran for 2 years. A real generation ship to Proxima Centauri at 1% of light speed runs for 420 years. The gap is not a refinement. The gap is a factor of 200. We have demonstrated on the planet that gave us all our life support intuitions that we can close an ecosystem for about 2 years before it breaks. We need, for a real generation ship, an ecosystem that stays closed for 400 years, or 4,000 years, or 6,000 years. There is no incremental version of this. We do not have a 30-year demonstration to point to. We do not have a 100-year demonstration. We have 2 years, and the 2-year demonstration failed. So now imagine slowly what this means in practice. Imagine standing inside Biosphere 2 at month 16, the 14.5% oxygen, the thin, slightly stale air, the desert visible through the glass, the Arizona sky burning blue beyond the dome, unreachable. The morning glories climbing the support beams of the agricultural plot, the pollinators silent because they have all been dead for months. The crew member you're watching is trying to hand-pollinate a tomato flower with a paintbrush. She's lightheaded. She is hungry. The other faction of the crew is in another part of the dome, and she has not spoken to them in 3 weeks. The mission has another 8 months to run. Now imagine that the desert outside the glass is not Arizona. Imagine that the desert is the actual interstellar dark, 4 trillion miles in every direction. Imagine that this is not month 16 of 24, but year 80 of 420. Imagine that the crew member with the paintbrush was not selected and trained, that she was born inside the dome, that her grandparents were born inside the dome, and that the 400 remaining years of her family's voyage are a problem she has to solve from the inside, with no help, with no replacements. That is the room we have already failed to keep alive, scaled up 200 times, with no exit and no horizon. It is not a problem the propulsion engineers can solve. It is a problem about whether a closed loop of life can be made to hold itself together for long enough, and the data we have from Earth says, plainly, that we have never come close. If the closed ecosystem inside the hull fails the way every closed ecosystem we have built has failed, the mission is dead. Not in the sense of arriving late, in the sense of nobody arriving. This is, biologically speaking, the wall, and we have not even gotten to the people yet. We have only gotten to the room. Now, let us get to the people. Part 6. The third quarter that never ends. There is a phenomenon, well documented in the psychiatric literature, that researchers call the third quarter effect. It shows up in long, isolated, confined missions. Antarctic winter rovers at McMurdo and Concordia and Halley stations, long submarine deployments, long-duration spaceflight, long isolation experiments. The pattern is consistent enough that it has its own name in the field. Crew morale, cognitive performance and interpersonal relations all decline sharply in the third quarter of the mission. Not the first quarter, when the novelty of the environment is still fresh. Not the second quarter, when the routines have been established. Not the fourth quarter, when the end is in sight and the crew is buoyed by the imminent return. The third quarter, the middle portion of the back half, the part where the mission is no longer new and the end is not yet visible. The third quarter is when people break. The patterns are similar wherever you find them. Sleep cycles disconnect from the schedule the mission is trying to maintain. Crew members start sleeping at different times of day, eating at different times of day, working at different times of day. Communication with mission control deteriorates. Reports come in late, reports come in short. Some crew members stop sending personal messages back to family entirely. Cognitive performance on standardized tasks declines, even when the crew is well rested by the metrics on paper. Interpersonal conflicts that had been bubbling for months come to a head. Small annoyances become large grievances. Cliques form. Hostilities harden. Some crew members withdraw into their bunks and become functionally inactive, doing the bare minimum required to keep the mission running and not much more. The most rigorous data we have on this comes from a Russian study called Mars 500. Between June 3rd, 2010 and November 4th, 2011, the Institute for Biomedical Problems in Moscow ran a 520-day simulated Mars mission. 6 men, 3 Russian, 1 French, 1 Italian, 1 Chinese. They lived inside a sealed habitat module on the Russian Institute's grounds for the entire duration. The module was not in space, it was in Moscow. The crew was simulating, with full communication delays of up to 20 minutes one way matching what a Mars mission would actually experience, the full mission profile of a crewed Mars expedition. Outbound transit, surface operations on a simulated Mars landscape inside another module, return transit. The mission ran to completion. All 6 crew members made it to the end. By any reasonable measure, it was a success. But the in-mission data, which the Russian researchers and their international collaborators published in detail, is sobering. By month 4, 2 of the 6 crew members had drifted into sleep-wake cycles disconnected from the external clock. They were sleeping when they were supposed to be awake. They were awake when they were supposed to be asleep. The mission was not run on a strict 24-hour schedule for them anymore. By month 5, one of the crew members had reduced his interactions with the rest of the team to the absolute minimum. He ate alone, he worked alone, he went to bed alone. He still functioned, he still completed his assigned tasks, but he had withdrawn, in some essential way, from the team. By month 7, communication delays with mission control had begun to be exploited rather than just tolerated. The crew, instead of sending back the dense scientific data that the protocol asked for, was sending back the minimum allowed. The team's reports were shorter. The team's video check-ins were briefer. The crew was, in some sense, retreating from the mission while still being inside it. By month 9, 2 of the crew members had stopped communicating with their families on Earth via the available channels. They had not told anyone they were going to stop. They just stopped. Their families noticed. Mission control noticed. The researchers ran psychological assessments. The crew members were not depressed in any clinical sense. They were just done. They had nothing to say. The mission had become, for them, the entirety of their world, and the world outside the habitat had become a vague concept they could not quite re-engage with. The Mars 500 crew came home, they reintegrated, they wrote papers, they went back to their lives. The mission, in retrospect, is treated by the field as an enormous success, because it demonstrated that a crew could complete a 520-day isolated mission and walk out the other side. 520 days, about a year and a half. That is the longest crewed isolation simulation we have ever run, and it produced the patterns described above. Now think about what a generation ship is. A generation ship is a mission where the crew never walks out the other side. The crew that begins the mission dies inside the hull. Their children are born inside the hull, their grandchildren are born inside the hull, their great-grandchildren are born inside the hull. There is no fourth quarter, there is no end of mission, there is no almost home feeling for the people on board, because for almost everyone on board, the hull is home. The hull is the only home they have ever had or will ever have. This is what makes the third quarter problem so much worse on a generation ship than on any mission we have ever flown. Take a person born in the third generation aboard a 420-year voyage. She is born 100 years into the mission. She lives to be 80. She dies 180 years in. The mission is supposed to last 420 years. From her perspective, she has not seen the start of the voyage. She has not seen the end. She is in the middle. Her parents were in the middle. Her grandparents were in the middle. Her children will be in the middle. The middle is the whole. There is no third quarter that gives way to a fourth quarter that gives way to a homecoming. The third quarter on a generation ship is the permanent condition of nearly every person aboard. This is not a small problem. This is the kind of problem that, if you take the existing Mars 500 data and try to extrapolate from it to a 400-year mission, you get patterns that look more like the population dynamics of small isolated communities under chronic stress than they look like a successful mission. The Antarctic literature has the same warning. Antarctic winter overs come back to normal after a single dark season. Some of them never come back to normal at all. The long-term Antarctic personnel, the ones who do multiple winter overs in a row, have measurably higher rates of certain kinds of cognitive and psychological adaptations that researchers describe as the winter over syndrome. It is not a clinical disorder. It is a pattern of behavior and cognition that develops when the brain spends too much time in a too small environment with too few stimuli. A reduced affect, a slowed sense of time, a diminished interest in long-range planning, a drift toward the immediate and the local. A 400-year mission would produce winter over syndrome as the default human experience, not deviation from the norm, and there is no fix for it. There is no mission planner's tool that lets you design winter over syndrome away. You can design the habitat better, you can put windows that look out on simulated landscapes, you can pump the air full of green tea and lavender and whatever else, you can pipe in birdsong, you can do every cosmetic thing the literature suggests. The fundamental fact remains. The crew is in a small enclosed space with the same people for their entire lives. The fundamental fact, the one nothing fixes, is the enclosure itself. So when the engineering papers talk about the third quarter problem, they often talk about it as if it is something the mission design can mitigate. With better social architecture, with better mental health support, with better simulated environments. Maybe those things help. At the margins, they probably do. But they cannot make a 400-year mission feel like a one-year mission. They cannot make the descendants feel like they are going somewhere when, from their perspective, they have always been here. They cannot make the room feel like anywhere but the room. This is why the engineering papers, when they get serious about the multi-generational architecture, start having to talk in language that sounds less like a propulsion paper and more like a paper on closed religious communities. They start having to talk about purpose, about mission identity, about cultural transmission across generations, about how you keep a story alive in the minds of the descendants when the people who started the story have been dead for centuries and the people who are alive now have never seen the place the story was supposed to be about. This is the part of the problem that, when you look at it long enough, starts to feel like it should not be solvable. Not because the engineering is impossible, although the engineering is hard, but because the social architecture that would be required to solve it would, by its own logic, have to be designed to remake the descendants in the founder's image, to prevent the drift, to enforce the mission, to keep the children believing in the journey that the children did not choose to be on. And that is the kind of architecture that, In every other context in human history we have a different name for. We are going to come back to that. We are going to come back to it in the next part, where we have to look at the descendants directly and ask the question that Schwartz and Claes and Welch and the consent literature ask, and that nobody has yet figured out how to answer. The question is simple, and it is the question every generation ship runs into, the moment you take the descendants seriously. Did the children we send actually agree to be sent? Part 7. The children who did not choose. Here is the thing about a generation ship that is hard to say plainly. When you launch a generation ship, you're not just sending the people who climb aboard, you're sending people who do not yet exist. You're committing, on their behalf, in advance of their birth, that they will live their entire lives inside the hull of a vehicle that has been moving through the dark for as long as they can remember. Their childhoods will happen here, their friendships will happen here, their loves will happen here, their adulthoods will happen here, their deaths will happen here. And they did not, in any sense recognizable to ethics or law, agree to it. This is the consent problem. And it is the problem that, when you really look at it, is harder than any of the engineering problems we have looked at so far. Let me make this as concrete as I can. Imagine that you are alive today, that you are a person making decisions about your own life. You can decide whether to climb aboard a generation ship that is scheduled to depart in a year. You are free to say yes. You are free to say no. If you say yes, you have made a binding choice on behalf of yourself, and the law and the ethics of that choice are roughly the same as the law and ethics of any other major life decision. You signed up. You knew the terms. You went. Now consider your child. If you have a child after you board, that child has not signed up. That child will be born inside the ship. The ship's environment will be the only environment that child knows. The 400 years to Proxima will be, from that child's perspective, their inheritance. And nobody asked them. You might say, well, parents make decisions on behalf of their children all the time. Parents choose where the family lives. Parents choose what school the child attends. Parents choose what religion, what language, what neighborhood. None of these decisions are made by the child. The child has no choice. This is just how being a child works. That is true. But there is a difference. A child born in Boston is born into Boston. They can leave Boston when they grow up. They can move. The decision their parents made about where to live is a default that the child can override later. The child has the option to walk out the door. A child born on a generation ship cannot walk out the door. There is no door. The decision that the parents made, the decision to be on the ship, is binding on the child for the entirety of the child's life. There is no overriding it later. There is no leaving Boston. There is no other Boston. The ship is the universe. From the child's perspective, until the ship arrives at Proxima Centauri, which the child will almost certainly not live to see. The child is born inside a decision and dies inside it. This is the argument that James Schwartz, a philosopher at Wichita State University, made in a paper published in 2019. Schwartz argued in a paper that drew immediate attention in the interstellar studies community that the descendants of the founders never gave informed consent to the mission, that no plausible legal or ethical framework recognized on Earth grants the founders the right to bind their grandchildren to a multi-generational journey, that the standard argument from inherited circumstance, the argument that says parents always bind their children to circumstances the children did not choose, does not extend to this case because in this case the binding is total and irrevocable. A few months later, two researchers named Claes and Welch picked up Schwartz's argument and pushed it further. They proposed that, beyond the founders' lack of authority to bind their grandchildren, there was a deeper problem. The descendants of the founders might, when they grew old enough to understand the situation, rationally choose to reject the mission entirely. They might decide that they did not want to colonize a planet 4 light years from where they were born. They might decide that the planet was not their home and was not where they belonged. They might decide that the hull of the ship was their home, that they had no reason to leave it, and that the founders' plan to disembark them onto a hostile planet at the end of the voyage was, in fact, an insult. The descendants, in other words, might mutiny, not violently, not necessarily with weapons, but politically. They might reach the destination, and once they reached the destination, they might stay aboard the ship. They might use the destination star system as a fueling station and continue on. They might turn around and go back. They might fragment, with some going down to the planet and others remaining in the ship. They might do any of these things, and none of it is the founders' choice to make. The founders are dead. The founders have been dead for centuries. The descendants are the ones who are alive at the destination, and the destination is theirs to use as they see fit, not as the founders intended. This is what Claes and Welch called, in their paper, the reception problem. The mission's success in propulsion and biology terms does not guarantee success in mission completion terms, because mission completion is a choice the founders cannot make. They can build the ship, they can train the founders, they can write the manuals, they can set up the educational curriculum that will, they hope, transmit the mission's purpose down through the generations. They can do everything that is in their power to do. And they still cannot make the descendants want what the founders wanted. The descendants are free, in the deepest sense, to choose otherwise. And they may choose otherwise. Now think about what that means for the founder generation. The founders are signing up, on behalf of grandchildren who do not yet exist, for a mission whose success depends on those grandchildren agreeing to a plan the founders cannot guarantee they will agree to. The founders are betting, in effect, that the social architecture they design, the educational curriculum they write, the cultural transmission system they build, will succeed in producing descendants who keep the mission alive. They are betting that 15 generations of human beings, none of whom have ever seen the Earth, none of whom have ever met the founders, none of whom have ever lived in any environment other than the ship, will all somehow decide that the founders' plan was correct, that the planet that the founders chose is the planet they want to colonize, that the destination star system is their destination too. That is a hell of a bet, and it is a bet the founders are not just making with their own future, they are making it with the lives of their descendants. The descendants who will spend their whole lives inside a hull, breathing recycled air, looking at painted skies, knowing the Earth only as a story their teachers told them, knowing the destination only as a number on a star chart. The descendants who, when they are old enough to think about it, may look around at the ship and decide that they are prisoners, that they were born into a punishment that no court sentenced them to, that the founders, in committing them to this voyage, did them an injury that no apology can repair, because the founders are dead and the apology is unfindable. Take a moment with that. Take a moment with the idea that the descendants might, with full justification, look back at the founders and consider what was done to them an injustice, not an honest mistake, not a noble sacrifice, an injustice, a wrong that was done to them by people who were not authorized to do it. This is the moment in any honest treatment of the generation ship architecture where the engineering paper stops working. This is the moment where the propulsion numbers and the closed ecosystem data and the demographic models all become irrelevant, because the question is no longer whether the ship can be built. The question is whether the ship should be built. The question is whether the kind of person who is willing to launch a generation ship is the kind of person we want to be. The question is whether the descendants, when they look back at us across centuries, will thank us or will curse us. The descendants will not all curse us. Some of them will believe in the mission. Some will love the ship the way a person can love a home that was not their choice, because it is theirs, the way a child born into difficult circumstances can love their parents despite the difficulty. Some of them will be fine, but some of them will not be. Some will look out at the painted sky and feel a grief that has no name. Some will hold the founders' letters in their hands and understand that the kindness was the kindness of a person who never met them, who never could have met them, and who made a decision about their lives in their absence. Some will hate the founders for that. Some will love the founders for that, and the love will still be braided with grief. Imagine, just for a moment, a 15th generation reader on the ship. She's 20 years old. She's sitting in her family's quarters in the rim of the cylinder, with a window that looks out on a slow-rotating starfield. Her grandmother has given her a paper letter. The paper is brittle. The handwriting is in a kind of cursive that is no longer taught in the ship's schools. The letter is from her great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, a member of the founder generation, written in the months before launch. He's writing to her by name. He has predicted, with the help of the mission planners, the names that would likely propagate through the family line, and his guess was correct, and the letter is addressed to her. She reads slowly. The language is half familiar, like reading something written in the English of 200 years ago. The founder is explaining to her why the mission matters. He is telling her about Earth, about the sky he could walk under as a young man, about the smell of pine forests in autumn, about the sound of rain on a real roof. He is telling her that he chose this mission because he believed that life should keep going. He is telling her that he is sorry in a way for what she will have lost. He is telling her that he hopes she will forgive him. She sits with it for a long time. She has never seen a pine forest. She does not know what rain sounds like on a real roof. She knows intellectually what the founder is talking about. She cannot feel it. The founder's grief, his apology, his hope, are all aimed at a person who can only partly receive them. The gap between the writer and the reader is not just 300 years. It is the gap between a person who lost a thing and a person who has only ever heard about it. She does not know whether she forgives him. He did something on her behalf, 4 generations before she was born, and the thing he did was the cause of her life. To refuse to forgive him is to refuse her own existence. To forgive him too easily is to pretend that she had a choice she did not have. She lives with the unresolved. That is the moral situation of every descendant on every generation ship that has ever been imagined. They are the children of an injustice that was also the precondition of their lives. They cannot wholly accept it. They cannot wholly reject it. They are free to keep the mission or to abandon it. And the choice in the end is theirs. This is the part the engineering papers leave out. The descendants are not a number. The descendants are people who will, one by one, decide what the mission means to them, if anything. And the founders, who launched the mission in good faith and at enormous personal cost, will be dead. They will never know what the descendants decided. In the next part, we're going to look at what happens to the descendants over the long span of the voyage, even apart from the consent question. We're going to look at how their language drifts, how their genes drift, how their culture drifts, how the founders' purposes become, slowly, generation by generation, something the descendants do not quite recognize as their own. We're going to look at what the long voyage does to identity, to community, to the meaning of the word us. We're going to look at the drift. Part 8. The drift. Latin, in the Western Roman Empire, was a single language. It was the language of the army, the language of administration, the language of educated people across an enormous swath of Europe and the Mediterranean. When the empire collapsed in the 5th century, Latin did not die, it drifted. The Latin that was spoken in Gaul became, slowly, French. The Latin that was spoken in Iberia became Spanish and Portuguese and Catalan. The Latin that was spoken in Dacia became Romanian. The Latin that was spoken in Italy itself became Italian. By the time you arrive at the year 1500, the descendants of Roman Latin speakers no longer understand each other. The Romanian speaker and the Portuguese speaker, both descendants of the same original tongue, can communicate only with great effort and only through translation. This took about 1500 years. The English of Geoffrey Chaucer, written in the late 1300s, is, to a modern English-speaking reader, a kind of half-foreign language. You can recognize many of the words. The grammar is mostly familiar. But the spelling is strange, the pronunciation is unrecognizable from the spelling, and the meanings of certain words have shifted in ways you have to learn before you can read fluently. The Knight's Tale, in its original Middle English, is not impenetrable. It is not Greek. But you cannot read it the way you read a modern novel. You have to work at it. You have to consult footnotes. This drift took about 650 years. Now consider a generation ship that runs for 420 years. That is roughly 17 generations. That is well within the time frame of significant linguistic drift. The language that the founders speak at launch may not be the language the descendants speak at arrival. The drift will be smaller than the drift from Latin to Romanian, because 400 years is shorter than 1500. The drift will be smaller than the drift from Chaucer to modern English, because 400 years is shorter than 650. But the drift will not be zero. The drift will be measurable. The language at arrival will be different from the language at launch, in ways that the descendants, when they read the founders' letters, will have to navigate. And if the voyage is 6,300 years, the Marine and Belufi reference voyaged to Proxima at 0.8% of light speed, the drift is far larger. 6,300 years ago, we were just inventing writing. The languages that were spoken 6,300 years ago are, with only a few exceptions, dead languages. The proto-languages from which modern languages descend are reconstructed by linguists using comparative methods. The actual speech of the people who lived 6,300 years ago is, in most cases, lost. The descendants who arrive at Proxima after a 6,000-year voyage are, linguistically speaking, as far from the founders as we are from the people who built the first temples and the first wheels. This is one kind of drift, the linguistic kind. It is documented, it is well understood, it is inevitable. There is no closed human population in history that has not, given enough time, drifted linguistically from its starting point. You cannot prevent it by educational policy. You can slow it. You can introduce conservation measures. You can make the original language the language of religion or government or science. You can try to keep it as a living tongue while the everyday speech drifts. The Catholic Church did this with Latin for 15 centuries. The Hebrew of the Torah was preserved across 2,000 years of diaspora as a religious and scholarly language, while spoken Hebrew became, eventually, a different thing. Both of those efforts required enormous institutional commitment. Both of them still produced drift, just less drift than would have happened without intervention. You cannot stop the drift. You can only manage it. Cultural drift is more complicated than linguistic drift because culture is harder to measure. But the same pattern shows up wherever you look. Religions split into denominations. Political ideologies split into factions. Family traditions split between branches. The things that one generation takes as obvious become, 2 generations later, things that have to be explained to the children, and 3 generations later, things that the grandchildren have not heard of. The founders of a generation ship, however carefully they design the educational system and the cultural transmission protocols, will not be able to prevent the drift of meaning. The mission that was a passionate project for the founders, freighted with their personal stakes and their hopes for the future, will become, for the 5th generation, a routine. For the 10th generation, a duty. For the 15th generation, a story they were taught in school. The descendants who arrive at the destination star system will inherit the mission the way modern Americans inherit the legacy of the founders of the United States. The legacy is real. The legacy matters. The legacy is also, by the 15th generation, the subject of debate, of reinterpretation, of partial repudiation, of revival, of redefinition. This is not a critique. This is just what happens. Humans, given enough generations, redefine inheritance. There is no closed human population in history that has not done this. The descendants of the Pilgrims do not believe what the Pilgrims believed. The descendants of the original Buddhists do not practice what the original Buddhists practiced. The descendants of Galileo do not do science the way Galileo did. Inheritance is real, but inheritance is also a thing that gets transformed by every generation that holds it. Then there is the genetic drift. Hill, Marine, and Pearson, in their 2022 paper in the International Journal of Astrobiology, modelled the slow movement of allele frequencies in a closed founding population. Even a 500-person founder set, with careful reproductive management, accumulates measurable allele frequency drift over 400 years. Over 6,000 years, the drift can become substantial. The descendants are not a different species. They're not even close to being a different species. But they are, in measurable population genetic terms, a different population. Their genetic distance from the original founders, by the time they arrive, is comparable to the distance between geographically isolated modern human groups on Earth. They are recognizably descended from the founders. They are also recognizably a population that has had its own history, its own drift, its own randomness. This matters less than you might think, in terms of what the descendants look like. It does not mean they will be 10 feet tall or have green skin. It does not mean any of the dramatic things that closed population evolution might produce given enough generations. 400 years is too short for that. 6,000 years is too short for that. The dramatic evolutionary changes you see in fossil records take hundreds of thousands or millions of years, not a few generations. But it does mean that the population that arrives at the destination is, in the strictest population genetic sense, not the same population that left. The drift is real. The drift is measurable. The drift is, in some small but quantifiable way, the species changing as a function of being on the ship. Imagine her now, the 15th generation reader, sitting in her quarters, holding the founder's letter. The paper is brittle. The handwriting is in a cursive style nobody on board has used in 2 centuries. She's 20 years old. She has been studying the founder's English for a year in school. She's more fluent in it than most of her peers. She can read this letter without help. She's one of about 40 people in her generation aboard the ship who can. Most of her friends cannot read this letter. They speak the ship's modern dialect, which has drifted from the founders' English in the same way American English has drifted from the English of the 17th century. The dialect is a real language with a real literature. The founders' English is the language of the school curriculum and of the historical archive. It is not dead. It is just no longer the everyday speech. She tries to imagine what it was like to write this 300 years ago on a planet she has only seen in archived images. The founder is writing about pine forests, about rain, about wind, about birds. The ship has a botanical compartment with a small section that simulates a temperate forest, but the trees are pruned to fit the available height, and the smell, even there, is filtered. The founder's references slide past her without quite landing. She's moved anyway, not by the descriptions of pine forests, by the act of the founder, writing across 300 years, addressing her by name, hoping for her existence. He imagined a granddaughter he could speak to. She has a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather she can only listen to. The relationship is asymmetric. She cannot answer the letter. The founder is fixed in time. The letter is the only thing he can do. She folds the letter carefully. She puts it back in the archival sleeve her grandmother gave her with it. She holds it in her lap for a moment. She thinks about the founder's last sentence, which was, in the original cursive, "I hope you will forgive me." She does not know whether she forgives him. She does not know whether forgiveness is the right word. She knows that he is dead. She knows that whatever she decides about him will not reach him. She knows that the letter was written, in some sense, less to her than to the act of writing it. The founder needed to write the letter for his own reasons before launch, before he died, before he could know whether anyone would ever read it. She's part of his answer to himself. She's the receiver of a message that was, in some sense, never really meant to receive a reply. That is the drift, in human terms. The founders write to descendants they cannot meet. The descendants read the writing of ancestors they cannot answer. The language shifts in between. The culture shifts in between. The genes drift in between. The descendants are not the founders, and the founders are not the descendants, and the long voyage is the slow widening of the gap between them. In the next part, we are going to look at what happens if the descendants, having drifted, having become themselves, having arrived at the destination star system, decide that the founder's plan is not their plan. We are going to look at the moment, if it comes, when the descendants refuse the mission. We are going to look at what the founders cannot guarantee about the end of the voyage they planned. Part 9. The Mission. The descendants refuse. The founders, however carefully they plan, cannot finish the mission. They can launch it. They can design its first 100 years. They can write the curriculum that their grandchildren will study. They can leave letters for their great-great-great-grandchildren. They can do every conceivable thing to set the descendants up for a successful arrival. They cannot make the arrival happen. They cannot, because by the time the ship reaches the destination star system, the founders are dust. The decision about what to do at the destination belongs entirely to the descendants, and the descendants may not choose what the founders chose. This is the reception problem in its most pointed form. The founders have designed the voyage as if it has an ending. The mission profile reads, in every official document, like a sentence with a period at the end. Launch in 2800. Arrive at Proxima Centauri b in 3220. Begin orbital surveys. Begin atmospheric assessment. Begin lander deployments. Begin colonization. The mission ends, in the founders' minds, with a thriving settlement on a world 4 light years from Earth. But the period at the end of that sentence is not the founders to place. The arrival is the descendants' moment, not the founders. And when the descendants arrive, they will have lived their entire lives inside the ship. They will be more familiar with the ship than with any planet. They will have raised families inside the ship. They will have built homes, in whatever sense the rim of a rotating cylinder can hold a home inside the ship. They will have, by every measure that matters to a human being, made the ship their world. And they may not, when the destination comes into view, want to leave it. Consider the planet that the founders chose. Proxima Centauri b, the most studied candidate for a near-future generation ship destination, is a planet that orbits its star every 11 days, tidally locked, with one side permanently facing the star and one side permanently facing the dark. The atmosphere, if it has one, is bombarded by intense stellar flares from the parent red dwarf. The radiation environment at the surface is dangerous. The temperature in the daylight hemisphere is potentially habitable, in a narrow band along the terminator. The night hemisphere is below freezing for the entire planetary year. The surface gravity is roughly Earth's, but the day is endless on one side and the dark is endless on the other. This is what the founders are sending the descendants to. Not a green Earth. Not a paradise. A tidally locked world with a hostile parent star, a thin or non-existent atmosphere, a narrow habitable band, and a surface that, even by the most optimistic models, requires extensive engineering to make habitable. The descendants are being asked to leave the rim of their rotating cylinder, where they have spent their entire lives in adequate gravity and breathable air and tolerable radiation, and descend to a planet that is dangerous in ways the ship is not. You can see why they might decline. The Clace and Welch argument is not that the descendants would mutiny in any dramatic sense. It is that, when the moment of decision comes, the descendants might rationally weigh their options and conclude that the rational option is to stay aboard. They might continue the mission as a permanent voyage. They might use Proxima Centauri as a refueling station, gathering volatile elements from the system's asteroid belt or its outer planets, and continue on to another star and another star and another star. They might decide that the ship is their home and the planets are way stations. They might invert the founders' framing entirely. This has been called, in the literature, the world ship argument. The ship is the world. The voyage is the destination. The original mission is, for all the descendants are concerned, a story their ancestors told them, which they have chosen not to obey. It is worth noting that the world ship framing is not the descendants' rebellion against the founders. It is, at least in the way some writers have argued it, the rational extension of what the founders themselves chose. The founders, when they launched, made a decision about how their descendants should live. They locked their descendants into a sealed habitat for the entire span of those descendants' lives. They made the ship the descendants' world. The descendants, choosing to remain in the ship at the destination, are not rebelling against this. They are honouring it. The ship is their world because the founders made it so. The planet at the destination is not their world because nobody has ever lived there. The descendants who decline to colonize the planet are not refusing the founders' mission. They are completing it. This is one of the genuinely strange features of the generation ship architecture. The mission profile that the founders write down at launch becomes, by the time the descendants arrive, a question rather than an answer. The founders are betting that the descendants will read the profile and agree with it. The founders cannot guarantee that. The descendants might read the profile, look around the ship that has been their home for their entire lives, look out the window at the new star and decide that the founders had it backwards, that the colonization plan was the mission's failure point, not its success, that a successful voyage is one that keeps going. There are subtler versions of the refusal. The descendants might agree that some of them should descend, but the colonization party might be small. The rest of the ship might stay in orbit. The founders' vision of the planet as humanity's new home becomes a small outpost the descendants treat the way we treat Antarctica. A research station, not a home. Or the descendants might split. Some might want to descend, some might want to stay aboard, some might want to turn around. The mission might fragment. Generation ships might become the source of their own descendant ships. The original ship splits at every destination. The original founders, 400 years dead, become the great-grandparents of a small civilization scattered across multiple star systems, none of which they would recognize as theirs. There is no engineering paper that prevents this. The reception problem is not a problem the engineering can foreclose. The descendants are people, and people make choices, and the choices they make at the destination are the choices they will make, regardless of what the founders intended. The founders' plan is a plan, not a guarantee. The mission's success in the sense of arrival and colonization of the chosen planet depends on the descendants agreeing, and the descendants might not agree. This is a strange thing to come to terms with when you're thinking about whether a generation ship should be built. You are designing a mission whose success depends on people you cannot meet, who will not exist for hundreds of years after you die, who will live their entire lives in conditions you cannot predict, and who are perfectly free, when the moment comes, to say no. The founders are launching a request, not a mission. They are asking the descendants a across centuries to please carry out a plan. The descendants are free to say yes. They're also free to say no. The founders cannot make them say yes. The founders cannot, in the deepest sense, make the mission complete. This is one of the reasons that, in the next part, we are going to look at why the mission has not been launched yet. Not just because the engineering is hard, not just because the closed ecosystem is hard, because even if all of that were solved, the founders would have to accept that they were sending a plan into the future without any way to ensure that the future would receive it on the terms they offered. They would have to accept that they were not really sending anyone anywhere. They were sending a population freely. The population would decide when it arrived what arrival meant. For most of the founders, this is a hard thing to accept. The kinds of people who want to launch a generation ship tend to be the kinds of people who care very much about the destination. They want the species to spread. They want the planet to be colonized. They want the great arc of human history to extend across the stars. They are not the kind of people who easily accept that their grandchildren might decline the plan, and so they delay. They keep designing, they keep refining, they keep asking in some quiet way whether there is a way to launch the mission that does not require them to surrender control of its outcome. There is not. This is part of what the Kennedy-Waitt paradox is really about. It is not just propulsion improvement. It is the unwillingness of the founders to release their grip on the outcome. The longer the mission waits, the more control the founders feel they can hold. The more control they feel they can hold, the longer the mission waits. The paradox spirals decade by decade and the launch never happens. We're going to look at that next. Part 10. The Wait That Never Ends. In 2006, a researcher named Andrew Kennedy published a short paper in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. The paper was titled Interstellar Travel, the Weight Calculation and the Incentive Trap. It is a single article, 12 pages long, with a single mathematical insight, and it has more or less defined the strategic problem of when to launch a generation ship for the last 20 years. Kennedy's argument is almost embarrassingly simple. Propulsion technology improves over time. The rate of improvement is roughly exponential, like most technology curves. A ship launched today, at today's best propulsion technology, travels at a certain speed. A ship launched in 20 years at the propulsion technology that will exist in 20 years travels faster. If you wait 20 years to launch, your ship is faster than the ship that was launched today. If you wait long enough, your ship is faster enough to catch the earlier ship before either of them reaches the destination. This is the weight calculation. The question is, when should you launch? Kennedy showed that, under reasonable assumptions about how propulsion improves over time, the answer is always later. The optimal launch date is never now. There is always a future date at which the projected propulsion will be enough better that the future ship overtakes the present ship, and so, for any present generation considering a launch, the rational answer is to defer. Wait 20 more years, wait 50, wait 100. The longer you wait, the faster your ship will be when you finally do launch, and the more likely it is to be the ship that actually arrives first. This sounds like a small technical point. It is not. It is the kind of small technical point that hollows out the entire enterprise. If every generation rationally defers to the next, the launch never happens. The ship is always being designed. The engineering papers always get a little better. The propulsion designs always improve. But nobody ever climbs aboard. Nobody ever closes the hatch. The waiting becomes the default state of the project. And the project, over decades, becomes a kind of perpetual deferral, in which the question, when will we launch, gets a slightly different answer every year, but the answer is always some future year, and that future year never arrives. This is, you may have noticed, an accurate description of where the generation ship project actually is right now. We have been thinking seriously about generation ships for about 100 years, since Goddard's sickbed manuscript. We have produced design after design. We have run population simulations. We have built closed ecosystem prototypes. We have not launched a generation ship. We are not currently planning to launch a generation ship. We are planning the kind of work that might eventually lead to a generation ship at some unspecified future date when the technology is ready. The technology, by any honest assessment, will always be readier next year than it is this year. Kennedy himself noted in the paper that the weight calculation does not actually predict that no generation ship will ever launch. It predicts that no generation ship will launch on engineering grounds alone. If there is any other motive in play, The weight calculation does not foreclose the mission. The motive has to come from outside the engineering, from religious commitment, from ideological commitment, from a sense of urgency that the engineering cannot supply, from a real threat to the home planet that makes departure suddenly necessary regardless of the technology level. In the absence of such a motive, the launch is always rational to defer. Imagine a meeting room. It is somewhere in the near future. The room is on the campus of some interstellar studies foundation, in some country that has put resources into thinking about long-duration crewed spaceflight. The walls are painted a calming grey. There is a long table. There are about 15 people in the room, all of them senior. Some are engineers, some are biologists, some are sociologists, some are bureaucrats. They have been meeting like this, in some version of this room, every year for 30 years. They are all old enough to remember a time when the answer to "when do we launch" was 20 years from now. They are also all old enough to know that the answer is still 20 years from now, even though 30 years have passed. Someone is presenting this year's design study. The slides show a new fusion ignition scheme that, on paper, gives a 5% improvement in achievable cruise velocity over last year's design. The shielding has been improved. The closed ecosystem prototype, on a small scale, has run for 120 days without external supplementation. The demographic modelling has been refined to incorporate new genetic drift data. The numbers are better than they were last year. Someone in the back of the room reads the weight calculation aloud from a printout. The room goes quiet. Not because the math is new. The math has been the same for 20 years. The room goes quiet because the math is true. The room goes quiet because the room has been pretending the math was not as decisive as it is, and every year the pretense gets a little harder to maintain. Someone proposes that the launch be deferred by another 5 years to allow time for the new ignition scheme to be tested at scale. The proposal is reasonable. The proposal is supported by the data. The proposal is the same proposal that was made 5 years ago, and 10 years ago, and 15 years ago, with slightly different technical details each time. The proposal passes by a clear majority. The meeting adjourns. The next meeting is scheduled for the same time next year. The participants file out. Some of them are aware that they will not live to see a launch. They have made peace with this. They are not in this project to see the launch. They are in this project to keep the project alive, to pass it on to the next generation of researchers, who will then pass it on to the generation after that, who will perhaps pass it on to the generation after that. The launch is somewhere in the future, where it has always been. This is what the Kennedy weight paradox looks like on the ground. It is not dramatic. It is not a crisis. It is a slow, year-by-year reasonable decision to defer, made by serious people, supported by good engineering, justified by every reasonable propulsion, improvement trajectory. The slow, year-by-year reasonable decisions add up, over decades, to the absence of a launch. Some writers have tried to argue against the weight paradox. The standard counter-argument is that propulsion improvement will saturate. At some point, the curve flattens. When it flattens, the weight calculation collapses and the optimal launch date becomes a real date. This is possible. Exponentials cannot continue forever in physical systems. But the trouble with the saturation argument is that you cannot know, from inside the curve, when the curve is going to flatten. You always think the next improvement is the last one. Then someone publishes a new paper with a new technique and the curve continues. The saturation argument becomes correct only in retrospect. So the weight paradox holds. The launch is always rational to defer. The decision never quite arrives, because every year that you do not launch, the next year's design is better, and your design becomes obsolete before you have even broken ground. There is a darker reading of this, which some commentators have offered. The weight paradox on the darker reading is not a feature of the engineering. It is a feature of the founders. The founders, the people who want to launch a generation ship, are people who want very much for the ship to succeed. They want very much for the descendants to arrive. They want very much for the mission's purposes to be honoured. And the deepest fear of such a person, the fear that the weight paradox secretly serves, is not that the technology will be insufficient. The fear is that the mission will fail in ways the founders cannot prevent, that the closed ecosystem will fail, that the descendants will refuse, that the population will fracture, that the 400 years between the founders' decision and the descendants' arrival will be filled with suffering the founders cannot intervene in. The weight paradox protects the founders from launching a mission that could fail. the weight paradox keeps the mission, year by year, in the safe space of the design phase, where nothing has gone wrong yet because nothing has happened yet. The founders can keep designing, and they can keep refining, and they can keep telling themselves that they will launch once the design is ready. The design is never quite ready. The founders never quite have to confront the question of whether they are willing to launch a mission whose outcome they cannot guarantee. The weight paradox in this reading is not really about propulsion. It is about the founders' relationship to their own descendants. The founders cannot quite bring themselves to send people into the dark for centuries, knowing what we know about closed ecosystems and the third quarter and the consent problem and the drift. The founders, having designed the mission, have to admit that the mission they designed is the mission they cannot finish, and so they do not start it. This may be the most honest answer to the question of why no generation ship has been launched in the century since Goddard wrote his manuscript. It is not that we cannot build one. We probably could, at very large expense, with a great deal of work, build one. It is that we cannot quite bring ourselves to. The descendants are too far from us. The mission is too long. The outcome is too uncertain. The founders, year by year, choose to wait, and the wait becomes the mission. The generation ship, on this view, is the mission humanity has been carefully not launching. It is the project that has stayed in the design phase by mutual agreement. It is the long, patient drift of 100 years of papers, none of which have ever turned into a hull in orbit. We have been thinking about this for a century, and the thinking year by year has been most of what the project actually is. There is a question, sitting underneath all of this, that we have been circling without answering. The question is whether the alternatives, the cryogenic ship and the digital ship, and the various other ways to send a person rather than a population are real alternatives, or whether they are just the same problem in different clothing. We are going to look at that in the next part. We are going to look at what we have proposed instead of the generation ship, and we are going to look at why those proposals in the end do not help. Part 11. The alternatives that are not alternatives. Whenever a careful person looks at the generation ship architecture, with its closed ecosystem failures and its consent problems and its multi-century waiting periods and its drift, the natural response is to ask whether there is a way around it. Some way to send a person to another star without sending a population. Some way to skip the descendants entirely. There are two main candidates. They have been on the table for almost as long as the generation ship itself. They are cryogenic preservation and digital upload. The cryogenic ship is the easier of the two to describe. The idea is to freeze the crew at the start of the voyage and thaw them at the end. The crew sleeps through the centuries. The ship handles itself. At the destination, the freezers warm, the crew wakes, and they descend to the planet exactly the people who left, with no descendants in between, no consent problem, no drift, no third quarter, no generation gap. The ship is a vehicle, in the original sense. The voyage is taken by the same people who started it. The problem is that we cannot do this. Not at the time scales required, not at the human scale. What we can do is short-duration cryogenic storage of small biological samples. We can freeze gametes, eggs and sperm and small embryos for years to decades, and recover them with reasonable success rates. We can freeze certain isolated tissues for similar durations. We can freeze blood and certain cell lines and certain microorganisms. The cryopreservation industry is real. It is medically useful. It is well developed within its narrow domain. The narrow domain does not include adult human bodies. The technical challenge of freezing a whole adult human and recovering them later is several orders of magnitude harder than the techniques we have. The problem is ice crystals. When you freeze a tissue, water inside the cells forms ice crystals. The crystals are sharp. They tear cell membranes. They damage organelles. They destroy the structure that life depends on. For small samples, you can use cryoprotectants, chemicals that prevent ice crystal formation, by forming glass-like solid structures instead. This is called vitrification. Vitrification works for small samples. It works for embryos. It works for thin slices of tissue. It does not work for whole organs. The cryoprotectants do not penetrate evenly through a large mass of tissue, because the diffusion rate is too slow to keep up with the cooling rate. The outside of the organ vitrifies, the inside does not. The inside forms ice crystals, the organ is damaged. The damage is, at the cellular level, severe and probably irreparable. For a whole adult human, with all our organs in place, vitrification is not currently possible. Some hopeful work has been done on isolated rabbit kidneys, which have been vitrified and rewarmed and transplanted successfully in laboratory settings. The work is preliminary. The kidney is a relatively small, relatively simple organ. The brain, which is the organ that matters most for personal continuity, is enormously larger, enormously more complex, and enormously more fragile. We do not have a vitrification protocol that can handle a brain. We do not have a protocol that comes close. Even if we did, the timescales would not work. Vitrified tissues in current practice are stored for years. The longest-running cryopreserved biological samples have been frozen for around 50 years, and we do not have rigorous data on what happens to them in terms of viability after that. Centuries of storage, the time scales a generation ship would require, are uncharted territory. We do not know whether vitrified tissue degrades significantly over centuries. We do not know whether the cryoprotectant chemistry holds up. We do not know whether the stored bodies would be recoverable, in any sense that produced living conscious people at the other end. The cryogenic ship, in other words, is a hopeful fiction. It is a story that lets people skip the generation ship problem. It is not, as of right now, a real engineering option. The papers that describe cryogenic ships are speculation papers, not design papers. They describe what such a ship would look like if the underlying technology existed. The underlying technology does not exist. It might exist someday, or it might turn out to be impossible. Either way, it is not currently available and there is no clear path to it. The digital ship is the other alternative. The idea is to scan the crew, capture every detail of every neuron and every synapse and every chemical state, encode all of that as data, and run the data as a simulation. The simulated minds make the voyage. When the ship arrives, the data is run on local hardware, in some kind of robotic body or a virtual environment, and the crew, in some sense, has arrived. No biological body needs to be preserved, no physical food needs to be carried. The voyage is, for the encoded minds, a digital experience, accelerated or paused at will. The crew can sleep through the centuries in a different way than the cryogenic crew. They can be paused, they can be turned off, they can be turned back on at the destination. Nick Bostrom and Anders Sandberg at the Future of Humanity Institute have written extensively on whole brain emulation, the underlying technology the digital ship would require. Their published roadmap describes the kind of scanning resolution and computational power required. The numbers are large, they are very far from where we are right now, but they are not, on the technical side, foreclosed. The trouble is philosophical, and it is a trouble that the digital ship proponents have not solved. The question is whether a digital emulation of a brain is, in any meaningful sense, the same person as the original. If you scan my brain in detail, encode all of it as data, and run that data on a computer, is the computation me? Or is the computation a copy, something that thinks it is me but is not? Nobody knows the answer. Philosophers have been arguing about it for decades. The functionalists argue that mind is just patterns of information processing, and any system that runs the right patterns is the same mind. The biological essentialists argue that personal identity requires biological continuity, and an emulation is a copy, not a continuation. Some argue that the question is malformed. For a digital ship, this matters. If you scan me, encode me as data, transmit the data to Proxima Centauri, and instantiate the data on hardware at the other end, the question of whether the thing that wakes up at Proxima is me cannot be answered with confidence. It might be. It might not. It might be something in between. The crew of a digital ship are betting their personal identity on a philosophical proposition that nobody can verify. And worse, the digital ship has a continuity problem the cryogenic ship does not. If you can copy a mind once, you can copy it many times. If the mind exists as data, the data can be duplicated. There is no fundamental reason that only one instance has to exist at the destination. There could be 10, there could be 1,000, there could be backups. If something goes wrong with one instance, another can be brought online. The notion of the singular self, which the cryogenic ship at least preserves in principle, does not survive the digital architecture. The digital crew is, in some sense, plural by default. So the alternatives, when you look at them carefully, are not really alternatives. The cryogenic ship is a hopeful fiction whose underlying technology does not exist and may never exist. The digital ship is a philosophical bet that has not been resolved and may never be resolved. Neither one cleanly avoids the problems of the generation ship. Both of them just relocate the problems. The generation ship in this light looks different. It looks like the only architecture that does not require a miracle. The generation ship requires only things we already mostly know how to do. Build a sealed habitat, keep humans alive in it, manage their reproduction, travel slowly through space. We have done all of these things at small scales and for short durations. The generation ship is the architecture that extrapolates from what we know. The cryogenic ship requires a technology we do not have. The digital ship requires a philosophical resolution we do not have. The generation ship requires only patience and scale. That is why, despite all its problems, the generation ship keeps coming back as the default architecture. Not because it works, because the alternatives work less. The generation ship is the least impossible of the impossibilities. It is the floor, not the ceiling. It is the architecture we are stuck with, if we want to send people rather than data to other stars. And so, we are back where we started. We are back at the multi-century voyage with the consent problem, and the drift and the third quarter, and the closed ecosystem wall. We have not escaped any of it. We have tried, with cryogenic preservation and digital upload, to find a way around. The ways around do not work. The room we have already failed to keep alive is, as it turns out, the only room we have. Every alternative we have proposed has been a different way of redescribing the same room. In the next part, we are going to look at the framing that emerges when you accept this. The framing in which the ship is not a vehicle going somewhere, but a world that travels. The world ship, the voyage as the destination itself. Part 12. The world that travels. In 1984, two researchers named Alan Bond and Anthony Martin published a paper in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. The paper was titled, simply, World Ships. Bond was a propulsion engineer. Martin was an interstellar studies researcher. The paper was in many ways a quiet correction of the assumptions that the generation ship literature had been making for decades. Bond and Martin pointed out that the standard generation ship framing treats the ship as a vehicle. A vehicle is something that carries you from one place to another. The vehicle is, by its nature, transitional. You get into it, you travel, you get out of it at the other end. The vehicle is incidental to the journey is to the destination. This framing, Bond and Martin argued, does not actually fit a generation ship. A generation ship is not a vehicle in this sense. A generation ship is too long, too slow, and too sealed for the vehicle framing to make sense. The descendants who live aboard the ship for their entire lives are not in transit. They are at home. The hull around them is not a vehicle they are temporarily inside. It is the only world they have ever known. If the descendants are at home, and the hull is their world, then the destination is not the point. The destination is, at most, a place the world might pass through. The voyage is the destination. The ship is the place. The whole concept of arrival, in the founder's sense, no longer applies. This is the world ship framing. It is one of the most useful inversions in the entire interstellar studies literature, because it makes sense of what a generation ship actually is, rather than what the founders pretended it was. Bond and Martin argued in the paper that under the world ship framing several of the problems that bedevil the generation ship simply dissolve. The consent problem becomes less acute, because the descendants are not being asked to make a sacrifice. They are being given a home. They live in the home. The home is the gift, not the burden. The destination is not a colonization project they have to be persuaded to participate in. The destination is at most an opportunity that they may choose to engage with or not. They are not failing the mission by remaining aboard. The mission is to live in this world for as long as they want to. The arrival, if it happens, is a footnote, not a conclusion. The Kennedy-Waite paradox also becomes less acute under the world ship framing. The Waite paradox is about reaching the destination first. If the destination is not the point, the paradox loses its force. A world ship is not racing other ships to a planet. A world ship is a habitat. It is competing with the alternative of building a similar habitat at home, in orbit around the Sun. The Waite paradox does not apply to the comparison. The drift problem also reframes. If the descendants are not expected to remain identical to the founders, the drift is not a failure mode. The drift is just the change that any community undergoes over generations. A village that has been continuously inhabited for 400 years is a different village than it was at the start. This is not the village failing. This is the village being a village. The world ship is the village. scaled up and put in motion. A small civilization that travels because travelling is what it does. This is a strange thing to take in. It runs counter to almost every assumption the popular conception of a generation ship makes. We think of generation ships as vehicles because we think of all ships as vehicles. The world ship framing asks us to see the ship, instead, as a kind of small world. Not a small world in the metaphorical sense, a small world in the literal sense, a self-contained habitat with its own ecology, its own culture, its own future. A world that, like all worlds, is moving through space, but whose existence is not contingent on where it goes. Imagine a child 7 generations into the voyage. He's 12 years old. All of his ancestors back to the 6th generation were born aboard the ship. He has never met anyone who has been on Earth. The Earth for him is a story, a planet his great-great-great-great-great-grandparents lived on before the mission. He's sitting in a classroom at the rim of the cylinder. The classroom has a long mirror window that runs along one wall. The mirror window is part of the ship's lighting system. It focuses light from external mirrors, which catch the light of the destination star still a long way off and the few other stars that are visible at the ship's current position. The light comes in soft and slow, the way late afternoon sunlight comes in through tall windows. The teacher is talking about the destination. He has been talking about the destination all year. The destination is part of the curriculum. The children learn about the destination star, about the planets in the destination system, about the candidate worlds for colonization. The teacher is showing slides of the candidate worlds, modelled in detail from observations the founders made and the ship's onboard instruments have refined. The teacher uses the word planet. The boy has heard the word planet many times. He has been hearing it since he was small. He has seen images of planets. He has been taught the major facts about Earth, about Mars, about Jupiter, about the giants of our home solar system. He has, in some intellectual sense, understood the word. He has not, on this day, understood the word the way he is about to understand it. The teacher says, gesturing at one of the candidate worlds, that this is where some of us will live. The teacher is being optimistic. The teacher is the ship's official representative of the founder's mission. The teacher believes, or at least transmits, the framing that the destination is what we are headed for. The teacher says, imagine standing on it. Imagine the gravity holding you down. Imagine the sky above your head. The boy listens. The boy tries to imagine. He has tried before. He cannot quite get there. He has lived his entire life in the cylinder. The gravity of the cylinder is the gravity he knows. The sky above his head is the underside of the cylinder, the opposite side of the rim, which he can see when he looks up. The sky, for him, is curved, and it has cities and farms and homes on the other side of it, just like the side he's sitting on. The word sky does not, for him, refer to a vault of air with nothing on the other side. It refers to a curved interior with people living upside down from his perspective. The teacher is using the word planet to mean something the boy does not have a referent for. The boy understands the word abstractly. He cannot feel it. He cannot picture standing on the outside of something, with the gravity pulling him toward the centre of the world below his feet, with nothing above him but air and weather and emptiness. The cylinder does not work that way. The cylinder is a world that surrounds you. A planet is a world you stand on. These are different geometries. The boy is having trouble bridging them. He understands in this moment for the first time that the ship is his home in a way the founders did not mean it to be. The founders meant the ship to be a temporary structure, a vehicle, a thing they would leave at the end. For the boy, the ship is not a vehicle. The ship is what a world is. The planets are something else. The planets are a kind of place he's heard of and may see one day, but he does not in any deep sense expect to live on one. The cylinder is his home. The cylinder is the kind of home he knows how to live in. He does not say any of this to the teacher. He is 12. He does not have the vocabulary for what he has just understood. He will spend the rest of his life slowly working out what he understood in that classroom, with the light coming through the long mirror window. He will not be the only one of his generation who understands it. By the time his generation is grown, the conversation aboard the ship about what the destination means will have shifted. Away from the founders' colonization plan, towards something the founders did not anticipate. This is the world ship framing, lived from the inside. It is not a refusal, it is a reorientation. The mission, from the descendants' point of view, was never to reach a planet. The mission was to live in this world for as long as they could. The destination, when it appears, is a star they will pass through. Maybe they will descend. Maybe they will not. Either way, the voyage does not end at the destination. The voyage is the home. This is not the horror it sounded like 3 parts ago. This is something else. It is the realization that the binary of arrive or fail, that the engineering papers always implied, is not the binary the descendants are actually facing. They are facing a third option. The third option is to keep being themselves, to live in the world they have inherited, to go wherever the world takes them, in whatever order, for whatever length of time, on terms they get to set, not on terms the founders set for them. The descendants are not failing the founders by reframing the mission. They are doing what every generation in every long-lived community does. They are taking the world they inherited and making it theirs. This is the moment in any honest treatment of the generation ship architecture where the horror starts to soften into something stranger. Not relief, not redemption. Something the listener does not have a name for. The voyage is the destination. The descendants live there. The founders' purpose was misread, by the founders, from the start. The descendants will read it more accurately than the founders did. In the next and final part, we're going to put all of this together. We're going to look at the question that opened the script, the question about who arrives and who does not, and we're going to answer it the only way it can be answered, which is to say, we're going to leave it open, because the answer in the end is not an answer. The answer is the question, looked at long enough to see what shape it actually is. Part 13. What arrives is not what left. The hull arrives. Whatever else happens, the hull arrives. The fusion engines that pushed it for 4 centuries or 4 millennia are still there at the back of the cylinder. The mirror windows still focus light from the new star into the rim. The agricultural compartments still produce food. The rotational systems still produce gravity. The hardware, if it has been maintained, arrives intact. Whatever damage the interstellar medium has done over the centuries, the ship has absorbed it. The ship arrives. The propulsion arrives. Whatever fuel reserves remain, whatever maneuvering capacity is left, whatever combination of reaction mass and thrust is available for the deceleration into the destination star system, all of it is at the descendants' disposal. The ship can be slowed. The ship can be parked in orbit. The ship can be set on a course out to the next star if the descendants choose. The propulsion arrives, ready for whatever the descendants decide. The DNA, somewhat drifted, arrives. The descendants are recognizably human. They are not a new species. They are not even a particularly divergent subpopulation. They are just a different population from the one that left. Their gene pool has drifted in the small statistical ways that closed populations always drift. They look, by and large, like the founders looked. They function biologically the way the founders functioned. They are a continuation of the founder population, in the sense that the modern population of Iceland is a continuation of the medieval population of Iceland. The continuation is real. The continuation is also, in some quantifiable way, different. The room arrives, somehow, against all the odds. The closed ecosystem, having failed every short-duration test we ever ran it through on Earth, having survived only by constant repair and constant compromise, having lost species and gained species and balanced itself precariously across centuries, the room arrives. Maybe the room arrives by being constantly intervened in by the descendants, who have become, over generations, more expert at running their closed ecosystem than any group of humans before them. Maybe the room arrives because the redundancy was good enough. Maybe the room arrives because the founders, who designed it, somehow, against expectation, got it right. The room arrives, but the intent does not arrive. This is the strangeness at the heart of the generation ship architecture. The intent, the original we, who decided to go, the people who looked at the stars and decided that the species should reach across the dark, the people who wrote the manuals and the curricula and the letters, the people who designed the rituals of mission identity that the 2nd and 3rd and 10th generations would inherit, those people do not arrive. They die. They die early. They die before the ship is 1% of the way through its voyage. The intent that launched the mission lives, at most, 80 years. The mission lives for 400 years, or 6,000 years, or longer. The intent and the mission part company within the first few decades of the voyage. The rest of the voyage is the absence of the intent. What arrives is a population. The population, by the time it arrives, has been shaped by 400 years of life inside the ship. The population has its own intent. The population has its own purposes. The population is the descendants of the founders, but the population is not the founders, and the population's intent is not the founders' intent. The population's intent is whatever the population has come to want. The population's intent is the intent of the people alive at the destination, not the intent of the people dead in their graves on Earth. So when the ship arrives at the destination, the founders' question, "Did we succeed?" has no one to ask. The founders are not there. The founders have not been there for centuries. The descendants who are there were never the people the founders meant to send. The descendants are the people the founders made possible by sending. The descendants are a result of the mission, not the mission's executors. The mission, in the founders' sense, dies with the founders. The mission, in the descendants' sense, is whatever the descendants decide it is. This is what we are left with. The longest voyage humanity will ever attempt is a voyage in which the people who attempt it are not the people who arrive. The voyagers and the arrivers are linked by genealogy and by hull, but they are not the same population, and they are not, in any deep sense, the same project. The voyage is the slow, patient transformation of one population into another. The arrival is the moment when the transformation becomes, for the first time, visible to anyone outside the ship. If anyone outside the ship is watching, there is no guarantee that Earth, 400 years after launch, is still receiving the descendants' messages. There is no guarantee that the descendants are still sending them. There is no guarantee that Earth, in the form the founders knew, still exists. The light travel time between Proxima Centauri and Earth is 4¼ years one way. By the time the descendants' arrival signal reaches Earth, the descendants have been at the destination for years. By the time Earth's response, if any, reaches back to the descendants, more years have passed. The conversation between the founders' Earth and the descendants' arrival is a slow conversation, conducted across centuries, with no guarantee of continuity on either end. What arrives, in the end, is a population in a new orbit. The population is recognizably descended from the founders. The population has, over 400 years, become its own thing. There is no Voyager who has crossed the gap. There is only the gap, and the populations on either side of it. The three callbacks that we have been carrying through this script return to us now, all at once, and they fit together differently than they did when we first met them. The voyage that has no traveller. At the start it sounded like a clever inversion. By the end it sounds like a description. The travel happens. The traveller does not. The room we have already failed to keep alive. At the start it was a description of Biosphere 2. By the end it has become a description of every alternative we have proposed. The cryogenic ship redescribes the room. The digital ship redescribes the room. We have failed to keep it alive at every scale we have tried. The descendants, if they arrive, will have done what we have never done. The descendants are free to keep the mission or abandon it. At the start this was a description of loss, the founders losing control. By the end, this is a description of agency. The descendants gain a world. They gain the right to decide what their world is for. The phrase faces both directions now. It carries the founders' grief and the descendants' freedom. It does not pick. The longest voyage humanity will ever attempt may be one in which nothing recognizably human is being voyaged at all. Not because the descendants are not human, they are. But because the kind of voyage we are talking about does not have a passenger, in any sense we have a word for. The founders launch, the descendants live, the destination receives. None of those three events involves the same person doing both ends of the journey. The continuity, if there is any, is in the chain of births, in the slow unbroken thread of one generation handing the ship to the next. The continuity is real. But the continuity is not, by any usual definition, a traveller. It is something else. It is what a long voyage is, when you look at it carefully. Maybe someday we will build one. Maybe someday the Kennedy weight paradox will collapse, and the rational moment to launch will arrive. If it happens, the people who launch it will be making a decision on behalf of grandchildren they cannot know. The descendants will hold their inheritance and decide in their own time what to do with it. They might honour the founder's purpose, they might modify it, they might set it aside in favour of a different purpose the founders never thought of. None of these are guaranteed. The founders, if they could see across the centuries, would have to make their peace with this. They would have to launch the mission knowing they could not finish it. They would have to accept that the longest voyage humanity will ever attempt is, in some essential sense, not a voyage they get to take. Maybe that is the deepest thing about the architecture, not the propulsion, not the closed ecosystem, not even the consent problem. The deepest thing is the requirement on the founders to surrender, to let the descendants be the descendants, to put the ship in motion and then to die, knowing that what arrives, if anything arrives, is not them. The hull arrives, the propulsion arrives, the DNA arrives, the room somehow arrives. The intent does not arrive, the intent dies on the way, slowly, with the founders. What arrives at the second star is a population that the founders set in motion. The population is not the founders. The voyage is not taken by anyone. It just happens, slowly, over a long time, and the world that was sealed in the cylinder at the start is, by the end, a different world, in a different orbit, with different people in it, who decide for themselves what to do next. And that, in the end, is what the longest voyage humanity will ever attempt actually is. Not a journey, a handing down. A long, slow handing down of a small world from one generation to the next, across the dark, until the dark gives way to a new star. The voyage is the change. The voyage is the slow becoming of something else. The voyage is what we have not yet attempted, and what, if we ever do attempt it, will not be ours to finish. It will belong, when it finishes, to whoever finishes it, whoever they turn out to be, whoever they turn out by then to have become,